Hey everyone, Screenplay Archaeology host KiramidHead here, and I just want to do this intro to get my usual batch of plugs out of the way. So if you like this show and you're interested in the subject matter, be sure to check out the Shelved podcast. And if you like this subject matter, but if you're interested in hearing these scripts read out line by line, listen to the Table Reads podcast. If you like this show, and you want to follow it, check us out on Facebook, Tumblr, and Twitter, and Blogger, and places like that, the social media pages. The show is on a bunch of different platforms. It is on iTunes, Stitcher Radio, Spotify, Google Play Music, among other things. So yeah, go ahead and leave a review on one of those platforms, and if I can find it, I will read it out on the show. And if you have any questions or comments, be sure to send an email to screenplayarchaeology@outlook.com. And if I don't get back to you immediately, it's because Outlook's app is kind of crappy and doesn't always notify me about stuff. So my apologies for that. And that's pretty much it. On with the show. Alright everyone, hello and welcome to a new episode of the Screenplay Archaeology podcast. I'm your host KiramidHead, and tonight I am bringing you a new episode, and this one is going to focus on Fantastic Voyage remake scripts. Now, of course, these are remakes of the 1966 sci-fi adventure film Fantastic Voyage, directed by Richard Fleischer, and it's a story about these scientists who pilot a microscopic submarine into the bloodstream of a scientist who's in critical condition and they need to clear a blood clot out from his brain that they can't get to any other way, and all the mishaps that they kind of run into along the way. And that's a movie which people say they grow up on movies. That is a movie which I quite literally grew up on, because that's one of the first movies I think I ever saw as a young one. I saw a lot of movies as a little kid, but this one I remember seeing it, and we had it taped on a tape. I was taped off a TV. Remember when we used to do that with blank VHS tapes? I still did that up until I was like 10 or something, maybe a little bit younger, a little bit older maybe, but we would tape stuff off a TV even after we got a DVD player. But also on that tape was Journey to the Center of the Earth, the old 50s movie. And so yeah, these were two movies I kind of always grew up with, but Fantastic Voyage is one which it's been a little while since I last saw it, but I've always enjoyed it. It's always been a very entertaining kind of adventure movie, and just this incredibly cool concept of getting to get really small and see the inside of a human body. It's like a space exploration, but in an incredibly different way, and I always thought it was really cool. And it's a movie, when you think about it, is ripe for remake potential, because it is a big spectacle special effects piece. And you could really do some crazy stuff with, like, new technology that you have nowadays. Like, you could do some crazy stuff with it and maybe expand the story in a few ways, which hasn't been done. So the idea of a remake is kind of a cool one. And so with that, we'll kind of delve into the idea of that. And of course, there was sort of a remake that was done in book form, because when the original movie came out, Isaac Asimov, the noted science fiction writer, did a novelization, which I haven't read, but everything I've heard about it suggested that he tweaked it because he thought the storyline was a little too ridiculous. There were some scientific things he could never quite reconcile. And then later on, they approached him about writing a novel, which, we can turn it into a new version of it in the 80s. He ended up, writing his own concept, and they encouraged him to, go off on his own and make it his own. So he wrote Fantastic Voyage 2, which wasn't a sequel, but, the basic idea, which I'd like to read that one just to see what it's like eventually. And of course, there was Inner Space in the 80s. I believe it was a Joe Dante movie, but it was like Fantastic Voyage as a comedy, which I've not seen that either. I should get around to that. But eventually, it took until the mid-90s before Fox, who owned the rights to the movie, decided that they were going to do a remake. And so what happened was Independence Day was a massive hit for them in 96. And so they went, okay, let's get, the guys who did that, let's get Roland Emmerich and Dean Devlin to work on it. So we'll get Emmerich to direct it. And from the TV side of things, they brought in Glenn Morgan and James Wong, who were writers on The X-Files. And they were pretty major writers. I think they wrote some of the more major stuff on that show. And so they brought them in to write this. So they kind of took, the science fiction, what was big in science fiction from movies and TV, brought it together. And so we get this version. So they wrote it, I believe, based off of a like a thumbnail that that Emmerich and Devlin had written. Let me see if I can find the reference to it in the book. Yeah, they were. Yeah, Emmerich and Devlin asked them to do it, and Devlin handed them some ideas. So I'll talk about that. And so the basic plot of this one. Now, what's interesting about this script is that the PDF I have, it comes packaged with about 4 pages of studio coverage, and it's actually really well written and interesting, and the writer makes some pretty good points. But what's interesting about it is that it's apparently written for Walt Disney and Touchstone Pictures, which, since this was a Fox project, I'm not sure how Walt Disney and Touchstone got involved, but you never know. But they give you a log line, so I can give you a synopsis of what the movie is about right off the bat, just reading it off here. And they say it's a specially designed submarine is miniaturized along with its crew. That's actually not correct, but to perform delicate brain surgery on the President of the United States, who is due to sign a vital peace agreement. And, there's some greater context. It's about, a possible, World War III scenario in East Asia, and there's some stuff involving nano machines that go haywire, which is what requires, the miniature submarine in the first place. But that's basically what the plot of this thing is. Now, getting down to the actual script here, and it's pretty long. It's about 139 pages. Well, we'll get right into it, but as soon as I get my notes up. It's a first draft dated June 12th, 1997. And okay, so it opens on a shot zooming out from the inside of an eye, and it's showing you like the reflection of the image that the eye is looking at on the retina, which I think is a really cool idea, even if this is almost kind of a needlessly expensive shot to insert into the movie, because you don't really need, this scene of an eye, but, whatever. But it is a cool idea, and it sets up the theme of the inside of the body pretty early, and it actually bookends the plot in a way. And so, it's looking through a microscope as an eagle is etched onto a bullet casing, and you can see the eagle reflected in the retina. And from there, we go to Air Force One, where President Daniel Hart Greer, who is specified as being African American, so he's basically a somewhat younger version of Morgan Freeman from Deep Impact. And he's on his way to Tokyo, and it's set in what was then the near future of August 28th, 2014. And they mentioned that it's the 100th anniversary of the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, which touched off World War I. And so a third world war seems to be brewing in East Asia on account of China antagonizing Taiwan with a naval blockade. And this is just kind of threatening to destabilize the whole region. There's all these different things they're talking about, like Japan is kind of has a role in it, and there's even talk of like Iran and nuclear weapons, among other things. So basically all of Asia is just it's like a powder keg. And Greer hopes that the peace talks he's holding in Tokyo can prevent this war. And so as the plane approaches Haneda Airport, we see that the Chinese embassy in Tokyo has been picketed by Japanese extremists, whom their movement has never really given a name or any sort of ethos. They're just against the West. And so they're protesting the peace talks, and one of them is a man who has, like, I want to say, like, they're wearing something, and I'm not, it's called, like, a hachi something? Let me see if I can look it up. It's an odd little description. A hachimaki, and it's on their head. It has, like, written vows on it to preserve Japan. I'm guessing it's like those things that the pilots wore in World War II. I didn't do the research on this, but some of them have words written on them, like saying the past is history is the future. And there's one guy who has the exact eagle that we saw in that bullet. That's on his hachimaki. And so, this guy is pointed out as being an assassin. So we know something's brewing here. And that's when we jump to and meet Secret Service agent Adam Richter, who's the head of the Tokyo Bureau, who tries to get the protesting crowds dispersed when he's approached by the president's men, who want to know what his plan is. They don't like his refusal to rely on technology, and we learn here that Richter took a bullet for a presidential candidate, but still failed to save him, which is why he's been given a crappy job on foreign soil away from the U.S., and he's only still in charge because of time constraints and the fact that, he knows Japan pretty well from having been there a while. And yeah, the whole thing about him not using technology, like, it's this whole thing that in this what was then the near future, everybody has like these like palm top computers that they're called. They're basically tablets, and everything is worked on a tablet, and that's what the standard is. And they start giving Richter crap because he's using a handheld, like an actual paper map, to plot out the route from the airport to the Royal Palace, which is where the peace talks are supposed to occur. And I'm like, why are you giving this guy shit? Like, he's doing his job. He's being very thorough at planning out, what he's doing here. And you're giving him shit because he's using a paper map to do it. Like, come on, guys. But so, yeah, we set up the idea that Richter is a character who needs a certain amount of redemption. And so the presidential limo was escorted by the Secret Service and the Japanese police who have a helicopter involved. It makes its way towards the Imperial Palace, and Richter is riding with the president and the First Lady. And the First Lady's name is Jocelyn Greer, and her husband is Daniel Greer. And so when Richter reroutes the limo to arrive at the back door of the palace, the president talks him out of it, saying that they shouldn't sneak in as it would send the wrong message. We're trying to set a historic precedent here and all that. He wants to be a symbol, basically. And so Richter is convinced, and they go through the front gate. He goes against his instincts, and it's this whole thing which is kind of an arc, but not really for him. And they're approaching the front gate. Richter spots a man running through the crowd towards the limo. But, he tells the agents under him to stop the guy, but their little computers scan him as green. He doesn't seem to be a threat, so they just leave him alone and they don't listen. And he sets up an explosion that topples the limo before getting gunned down by agents. And Richter, he regains consciousness first, and he drags the president from the limo. And he's taking him to a waiting ambulance when a sniper on a nearby roof fires, the bullet going through the agent and then hits the president in the shoulder blade. The sniper is pursued by a helicopter, and a police officer shoots him down as he fires on them, causing the helicopter to crash, even as the sniper falls off the building to his death. So yeah, a bit of an action scene there for you. And so the president is taken to Toranomon Hospital, where he is placed in a trauma room. And in a conference room, a group of officials, including a general named Gilbride, they discuss the incident, saying that the assassin was a Japanese extremist wanting to keep the West out of an Asian situation. And that's all we really learn about this group and this assassin. And the assassination attempt has also seemingly lit a powder keg in the region of multiple countries arming up and getting ready for war. So it seems like if the president doesn't get to do what he wants to do here, the world is just going to descend into conflict, which I feel like is a really interesting way to up the stakes from the original movie, because in the original movie it was a Cold War espionage plot where the Russians, and for very bizarre reasons, they don't actually call them the Russians, they just say the other side. They're both apparently working on the miniaturization technology, and they don't know how to make it last. Like, they can only make it last for 60 minutes. And the scientist who gets injured and they have to go inside his brain to get rid of the blood clot is the guy who's managed to crack it. So yeah, so that's what the stakes are here, is like who gets, the best technology, to win the Cold War. Whereas here it's like, well, the entire world will be fucked if, this doesn't go to plan. So I think this is a good way to update it. So Richter, he's being dressed down by the CIA director and Gilbride and a couple other people when the First Lady enters the conference room and reveals that the president is still alive. And so we get 4 doctors, Yomori Matsumoto, Naval Surgeon Captain Watkins, and Professor Yo, who kind of sits to the side in the shadows for a while. They enter the room and they begin to explain that while the bullet wound has been treated, the explosion caused a blood clot in the president's brain that has sent him into a coma of sorts, and they can't operate to remove it without damaging, his memory centers in the hippocampus, which would make him effectively useless as the president because he couldn't form new memories. He would essentially be Guy Pearce in Memento, if I'm understanding that correctly. And so Yo then speaks up, saying that there might be an extreme possibility to save him. And so from here, we get a small little roundup scene where we see 2 scientists, Yuko Itonaga, who is a female, and Jason Underhill, getting rounded up and brought to the hospital. And we see that Yuko is spiritual. She's praying at a shrine. And Underhill, on the other hand, is a bit cynical, and we see him just kind of goof it off in a karaoke bar. So that's kind of showing the difference between them, traditional and a bit iconoclastic. And they get brought to the hospital, and then we learn that they've been working on nanotechnology. So Richter objects to Underhill's presence, saying he's long been considered a security risk, as he refused to turn over the results of his military-funded studies and eventually disappeared after dodging a corporate espionage charge. And he turned up 2 years later in Japan, and so he pretty much accuses Underhill of working on the same technology for the Japanese government and basically betraying his country, and he thinks that, Underhill, a man who would turn on his own government, would actually not miss an opportunity to hurt the president even more. So Richter's suspicious of him, and his suspicions never really truly get addressed in this scene. Like, it's made clear that the CIA director guy is not following along with Richter because he doesn't trust Richter. But it's never actually addressed the fact that it's like, no, we're going with this guy because he's the only guy who can do it. Like, no one ever actually responds to what Richter is saying, which is a bit strange. And then, undeterred, they go ahead with Underhill's plan, injecting the president with several nanobots, 6 of them to be specific, that are programmed to act as microscopic surgeons. And this is intercut with Underhill explaining exactly how they're made and how they work, which goes on forever. And I swear this goes on for 3 to 5 pages of him going, we make these little things, these little machines that they're called microscopic assemblers, and they're built on the microscopic level, and we can recreate these things until we have as many of them as we need, and then they make the robots piece by piece, and then this does this and that does that, and this is what the robots are weak to, and blah blah blah. And I'm like, dear God, this thing just went into Star Trek Voyager levels of just horrifyingly awful technobabble. And it gets worse in a minute, but like, I mean, this whole scene, like, I can follow along what it's saying, but I don't think we need a lengthy explanation of how the nanobots work. I think we'll just go along and be like, yeah, we managed to create microscopic robots. I mean, nanotechnology is something that's been present in science fiction for forever now. And maybe in 1997 it was still relatively fresh to a general audience, but I mean, man, but I can't help but look back on it from my perspective now and just go, man, I have played Metal Gear Solid 4. I have played Metal Gear Rising Revengeance. Nanomachine's son, you can't beat me, is basically all the explanation I require these days. But it's just like, oh, it goes on forever. And so they inject the nanobots into his carotid, and then it goes wrong almost immediately because they go against programming, because he programmed them to remove blockage, and they start interpreting that very loosely, and they start going after cholesterol and stuff like that, and they start causing even more problems with the president, putting him in greater danger. And apparently they've developed minds of their own, because Underhill used something called soft programming, which allowed them to become self-aware, and Richter is like, you used soft programming, didn't you? And so we have to get an explanation of what soft programming is. And so Plan A has gone under, and Yuko speaks up, mentioning a classified experiment called Project Miniskirt, and Professor Yo at first is like, no, you shouldn't be talking about that. That's classified. And stuff like that. But Underhill, goes ahead and explains it involves a submarine called the Proteus, which in the original movie they shrank it down along with the people. Here they carved it out with one of those assembly machines on the microscopic level that can be piloted in the bloodstream by miniaturized human beings. And then we see a mixed gender Navy SEAL team led by Lieutenant Dodd, and it's consisting of Smoker Pooley, racist black guy Tubbs, and yes, that is his entire character, is that he's a black guy and he's racist against Asian people, because like one of his first lines is this bizarrely racist statement about we're gonna go. It's something about the ships. He says they're gonna go sink. I gotta look this line up. It's just okay. Where is this line? Okay, Tubbs. Oh God, he says, I say we're doing a little UD, blowing up some of them Hong Kong Fooey boats off Taiwan. Oh, and he gets worse later too. He keeps making racial cracks and stuff like that, and that's his entire character. And Pooley's entire character is being a smoker. And so there's a redneck guy named Huckabee, Bulinsky, who is from Philadelphia, and that's his entire personality. Agundez is the goofball, and he's the guy who pilots the submarine eventually. And then we have women who are Yoder and Furkovich. Yoder is, a normal-looking pretty woman, and Furkovich is kind of manly from what we get. And so they're scrambled to act as the crew of the Proteus. And so the president is smuggled to a secret facility run by the Japanese Ministry of Science, where the operation is due to take place. And even on the way there, Underhill is being just like a total annoying guy. Let me see if I can find the line, because they're in the fucking van on the way to this facility, and he starts talking about there's precedents for this, and talking about how Grover Cleveland was diagnosed with mouth cancer, and he apparently disappeared for 2 weeks, went to Canada to get his lower jaw replaced, and the public never noticed, or something like that. And he's like, maybe something what we're doing now could turn out as a trivia fact in future history. And it's like, God damn, stop being a douche, Underhill. Yeah, it's kind of annoying. And so Underhill insists that he and Yuko go along to help run the submarine, and while Richter volunteers, he's told there won't be room for him between them and the SEALs. And then Professor Yo explains the process to the new arrivals. Essentially, they are broken down by the assemblers used to make the nanomachines and rebuilt at microscopic size, but he takes forever to explain. Basically what it is that they can scan them and get the essence of them shrunk down, but there is leftover mass, and this is them trying to account for the physics, which is stored in cryogenics. And you could, I get what they're doing here, and it actually leads to kind of a cool moment later, but they could have explained that in a much more digestive fashion, much more condensed. It's like we went through multiple pages of just exposition just to explain this, and we don't need this much of an explanation. And so Huckabee immediately withdraws himself from the mission because he says, if I'm being copied down into a smaller version, I don't want to risk losing my soul, which was an interesting moment, but then Huckabee doesn't really do much else for the rest of the script, so kind of a waste of a character. And Richter volunteers to take his place, but General Gilbride refuses. And so the miniaturization process continues with the two scientists and the remaining SEALs getting immersed in orange goo. and are painfully disassembled, and it sounds just ugh. However, Lieutenant Dodd's reassembly goes wrong, and he gets put back together in like this gruesome, mismatched fashion with like skin in the wrong place and like his limbs all twisted and stuff like that. Reminds me of Star Trek The Motion Picture when the science officer gets scrambled and like you don't see what happens to him, but you get the idea that, you know, it wasn't anything pleasant. And so Richter, undeterred by this, once again volunteers, saying he's looking for redemption, and possibly because he has the First Lady's backing on this, you know, he's granted permission. So he gets miniaturized and boards the Proteus, and Yuko reveals, and apparently there's this whole thing where you have a short-term memory for a little while after you first shrink, and you have some side effects, which is kind of interesting, and they don't overplay it, which I appreciate. And then Yuko tells them they're losing body temperature faster than expected, and will begin experiencing extreme hypothermia. So that's sort of what the ticking clock is here, is that because in the original, they only have 60 minutes to do it. Here it's, you know, they only have so much time or else they will die of extreme hypothermia, because apparently their time, for some reason, getting shrunk down means that they're just, you know, they're just giving off body heat in waves for some reason. Like they're just losing it in record time. I don't really understand what's going on there. And it leads to some kind of silly things later in the way they're described. And so the crew gets everything in place. They get sucked into a hypodermic needle and they're tumbling around in the air. And Yuko vomits, and Puli goes, oh, well, that's going to linger. That's going to come back as a running joke. And they get injected into the president's carotid artery. 65 pages in. Oh, by the way, yeah, we spent all that time on exposition. I understand you need to take a little bit longer to get there in this version because you're doing the nanomachine thing. You still could have gotten them into the president's body a lot faster and moved this thing along a lot quicker, and we could have spent a little bit more time in the president's body a little bit, because it seems like certain bits go by a little quickly. And also, the guy who wrote the coverage points out exactly my problem. He says this exposition is tedious and overlong, and I agree. And so they get sucked in, and this is all handled by robots. Like, the president is directly handled by robots, and they're directed from a control room, where Huckabee is making himself useful by being the communications guy. And so the crew of the Proteus, now inside the carotid artery, are met by a fantastic view of red blood cells and platelets. And the ship gets attacked by monocytes, which are a kind of white blood cell, I think, in which Underhill gets rid of with an electric shock meant to be used as a defibrillator. And there's a Chekhov's gun, which is set up here, where they're covered in this goop by the monocytes, which is supposed to attract other antibodies. It sort of pays off, but not really. And so then they get attacked by one of the nanobots, which cuts through the arterial wall, and grabs a hold of the Proteus and blasts it with electricity, which knocks out communications, destroys their propulsion system, and it kills Furkovich, so there's one interchangeable Navy SEAL gone already. Bye, and it's one of the women. And so they manage to get away, but the nanobot tears another hole in the arterial wall, and they get sucked into the jugular vein, the nanobot getting left behind because the platelets plug the hole pretty quickly. So instead of the, I think it was called a fistula in the original, where there was like a gap that they didn't know about, here it's caused by the nanobot tearing through. The crew manages to right the ship, but without propulsion, they have to follow the blood flow to the heart, which could prove dangerous if they time it wrong, because they couldn't survive a contraction. They'll be torn apart. And it's actually kind of funny because in the original movie, like they're looking over like the body plan of the circulatory system and stuff like that. And it's like, this guy is like pointing at going like, well, there's only any real danger in the heart and we won't be going there. And of course they end up going there. I always remember that. I always thought that was pretty funny. And then Underhill proposes using the alveoli to help recharge the batteries and power the laser cannon back up. And so while the Proteus is attached to the alveoli, Yoder, Belinsky, and Puli go outside to work on repairs, and they get the dive plane untangled from this antenna thing, which got twisted around. And then Puli walks through some tar, which is the result of the president's smoking habit. He's like, oh, this is disgusting. And then he looks around and sees that like the entire place is covered in it. And they go like, dude, that's tar. The president's a smoker, and he just gets really freaked out by it, going like, I quit, which is pretty funny. And then he projectile vomits inside his helmet. And then when they go back in, Yuko sees him and goes, well, that's gonna linger, which is pretty funny. And so, but while they're out there, Tubbs is mourning Furkovich when Yuko approaches to check his body temperature, because Underhill, like, Yuko is really loyal to him during like those laboratory scenes and the hospital scenes where she's shouting at Richter going, you don't appreciate his genius, blah, blah, blah. But as soon as they get in there, Underhill becomes more of a douche and starts treating her like crap, and she doesn't really like him very much anymore. And this is kind of trying to set up where this is going near the end, but I don't think it really works because I find these two characters to just be a little weak because Yuko is a total cipher and Underhill is a little inconsistent and I'm never really sure what they're doing with him. But yeah, he just goes like, darling, just go check everybody's temperature or something like that. And it's like, what? And it's just too much. But yeah, he starts, lashes out with her because he's angry about what's happened and she's, prodding him for his temperature card or whatever it is. He just lashes out with these racist remarks and it's actually a pretty hard-hitting scene and I like this moment. Only for Richter to put him in his place with a rousing speech about how everyone's insides are the same. Like he's like, you see all this stuff around us? It's the same as in me and you and her and everyone else. And I'm like, thank you, Frank Capra from coming back from the dead and writing a speech. It is pretty ridiculous. And this is the moment where Yuko's like, hey, I don't dislike Richter after all, because she's really angry at him in those hospital scenes. And then she's surprised by the fact that he actually understands the science to some degree and he actually did his research. And so it's like, oh, this guy has hidden depths, and then he defends her from the racists. And she's like, I don't hate this guy anymore. It's kind of silly. And also, I forgot to mention, there's a awful racist moment from Tubbs before they get shrunk down, where he sees that there's a Japanese woman coming along and goes like, I'm paraphrasing from the script here. This is not me using racial invective. He says, great, she's a nip and a woman. I hope she's not driving. Which not only is it horribly racist and sexist, it's also a really terrible dad joke. Like, shockingly bad dad joke. Okay, from here, they get the batteries, recharged from the alveoli. And so they get that done, and so they get ready to take off, and Underhill is warning everyone to move as little as possible due to the onset of hypothermia, and to keep laying down when they enter the heart, apart from himself and Agundez, who's piloting. And I'm just like, some adventure movie this is, where they can't move, they have to lay down. Kind of dumb when you think about it. And he says, we need to conserve power so the laser can still take out the blood clot, so we can't use the heater even though we're slowly succumbing to hypothermia. And they also have handheld laser rifles, which we'll get to later. They become important later. And they've also packed glutamate torpedoes, which don't even get explained until later. And I'm like, why did you even bring those? But they cross from the alveoli into the bloodstream through a capillary, and it's actually pretty tense the way it's described because they're like just barely scraping through the capillary. And so they hitch a ride on a red blood cell headed for the heart. And so the Proteus makes its way toward the heart, while outside the body, Yo and Gilbride, they're watching, the progress of it. And because they can't communicate with the Proteus, they don't know if they're still alive or not. But they decide to, treat the situation as if they were. And they want to stop the president's heart temporarily to allow the Proteus to pass through it. And there's some delay when the first lady won't allow it, but they manage to talk her into it just in time for the Proteus to enter the heart safely. Like, it's literally just in time. And there's this really cool visual where they're looking up at the chambers of the heart, and they see through the roof of it, they see the hypodermic needle punch in through the heart, and they can actually see it from there, which I'm like, oh man, that sounds really cool visually. And so, Agundez is making some tricky maneuvers to get where they need to go, and they're moving through the heart, and they only have about 62 seconds before the heart has to be restarted. And it's very tense the way this is described. And they have to double back to avoid getting sucked back into the lungs through the pulp for a vein. They come in through the pulmonary vein, and they need to avoid getting sucked into the pulmonary artery, and so they have to do a quick about turn, which that shows up on the tracker, which confirms they're still alive. And they only just barely make it out because they actually ask Richter, who choose on his instinct which passage they should take to get out of the heart. And he stumbles and doesn't want to do it. So there's kind of an arc here. Then Yuko goes, go that way. And that's how they get into the aorta. And they only just barely make it out of there before it started again. And they get pushed by it and into the artery. And it's very tense. I gotta give credit to this scene. It's a remake. The overall journey through the body in this is very similar to the original movie. They go from the carotid to the jugular to the lung and then down into the heart and then back around up to where we're going to be going in a minute. But this is a really good example of a remade scene being basically the same, but amping up the tension and doing some different stuff with it. I gotta give them a lot of credit. And then they just barely make it out of the heart before it started again. And then they have to pass through where the bullet wound is, dodging scar tissue. And it's kind of cool. It's kind of like a racing game where you got to drive around the obstacles the way this is described. It seems very fun, like a very fun scene. And then they run to a group of white blood cells, which are immediately attracted to the substance that the monocytes sprayed onto it. And these are leukocytes, they say in the script. And so with the help of a boost given by the president unconsciously swallowing, because it's mentioned that, he's being kept in like this very low activity state, but he still can do unconscious stuff like swallow and breathe and things like that. And so that pushes them to the point where they can like turn off into the interior carotid, and they outrace the white blood cells, which keep going off into the other direction. So yeah, that's pretty intense. And there, Underhill asks Yuko to tell them where they're heading, but she feels the effects of the hypothermia in earnest. Her senses are getting fuzzy, and she manages to work through it and read the chart saying they're heading for the inner ear. And this is a scene where the characters start to realize that they're getting really sick with the hypothermia, and they start to freak out. And I believe it's here where Richter kind of pulls them together and gives them a speech, and they start listening to him. And Underhill is kind of pissed off by this because he fancies himself as the big swinging dick in charge. Pardon my turn of phrase. And so, they're heading towards the inner ear, and outside the body, they realize, hey, there's not much noise. The robots are very quiet. And then Yo suddenly realizes, oh no, we have to turn off the respirator for the time it's going to take them to get through the inner ear. And so outside the body, and so they switch off the respirator, and then one of the robots that's changing the IV, it accidentally knocks over a pair of scissors, but that gets taken care of after clanging to the floor right before they pass through the membrane and into the ear. So yeah, that's kind of playing with your expectations, because in the original one, the nurses accidentally knocks over a pair of scissors, and that's what causes things to go wrong in the inner ear, because in the original movie, they have to stop in the inner ear because some stuff gets caught in their intake, and Raquel Welch's character is cleaning some stuff out, and then like the sound waves hit the ear, and she gets thrown off, she gets tangled in some stuff, and some antibodies attack her, and that's a scene everybody talks about because like her suit gets stripped off, but it's kind of intense and fucked up when you watch it. At least for me it is. But here, the inner ear isn't anywhere near as much of an obstacle. In fact, it goes by kind of quickly. They don't really milk the suspense as much as they could. And so while they are passing through the ear, though, an alarm from the cryogenic storage goes off, alerting the people outside that a storage unit has failed. And they tell you, the audience is told because the people, outside the body find out that it's Tubbs' storage unit, but the people inside don't know that. And I wish that had been kept secret, that we didn't know which cryogenic storage unit failed, so we didn't know who was going to die. And so they're in the ear, and this causes chaos and pain for a bit. They're all shook around. But they managed to make it through the ear okay. But Underhill, he recognizes what the alarm is. Now, I don't know if you'd be able to recognize that sound from that scale. I think it would sound different, but maybe that's just me. But he's unnerved by it because he knows what it means. And they make it through the ear, and they start heading towards the brain. And so this is when the crew, they want to start using the heat systems, saying they can use the handheld laser rifles on the clot. But Underhill is intent on saving power for the large laser cannon, and even tells them that he knows one of them is already dead. And so they enter into the hippocampal area, and they approach the clot. And so Underhill orders Tubbs to use the cannon, but he refuses, essentially starting a mutiny, where all of the crew turn on Underhill, and they agree to try the handheld laser rifles on the clot. And Richter kind of de facto takes control at this point. And so everyone but Yuko leaves the ship to work on the clot, and the handheld weapons are actually getting the job done. And it's mentioned that they have to back off eventually because, once they break the clot, there's going to be like a massive flood of blood. And so then something is approaching, and Yuko tries to warn them, but they can't hear it over the noise. And it turns out it's a nanobot, which comes from behind the clot, and it kills a Gundez and cuts off the remaining seals from the Proteus, and they have to hide behind like a piece of muscle, I think it says. I wasn't really sure how to picture that. Sorry, I just kicked my laptop. And then a second nanobot attacks Underhill and Richter, which sends Underhill into shock, but Richter manages to get him back to the Proteus, and they were like, those two were actually hanging back a bit from the crews that were shooting the clot. And so they managed to get aboard, and Richter tries using the laser cannon on the nanobots, no success. They tried that earlier. And this is one thing I have to mention. Like, they go in there, they know they're going to have to fight these nanobots, and they know that the only thing these things are vulnerable to is like intense heat. But they don't really seem to have prepared very well for that, and that could have used more of an explanation. And so Yuko gets the idea to use their glutamate torpedoes on them, which can it's like stuff that can conduct electricity, and they can time it with the firing of nearby synapses, and then shoot them with the laser while the electricity is flowing, and that will blow them to atoms. And without the propulsion, though, the Proteus moves back every time it fires. So, we're seeing some physics here, which is kind of cool. And they managed to nail one nanobot and destroy it, only for a third to arrive on the scene and attack. And so So with a good amount of struggle, this is a pretty good action scene which goes on for a while. They use the glutamate method to destroy the other two nanobots as well, but, this has caused, the president to show signs of a seizure. The electrical activity looks like a seizure, so Yo was like, oh god, his life is in danger. We need to operate on him and do this invasive surgery now or he will die, not realizing what's actually going on. And so back in the Proteus, the remaining 3 nanobots arrive on the scene, having connected together to form one large mama bot. This is just silly, like it's a Constructabot from Transformers. Richter puts a plan together to stop it, which requires shooting both remaining torpedoes down its maw and ramming it, using the laser cannon to dislodge the clot entirely and cause a blood flood. Yes, I know that rhymes. So the flood is started, and Richter is piloting the Proteus towards the Mamabot when Underhill intervenes, and he's rambling about how, like, new life has evolved from life I created, blah, blah, blah. This thing deserves to live, and this is why I didn't want to tell the military, because they would have done something to it, and blah, 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 blah. And so he attacks Richter and tries to stop it, but he loses the fight, and Yuko gets in there and fires off both torpedoes, and so Richter and Yuko escape as the Proteus crashes, destroying the Mamabot and killing Underhill. However, this latest fluctuation in the brain prompts Yo to go ahead with an operation even sooner. He's like, hurry up, he's gonna die. Underhill's betrayal here, like, he's supposed to be the equivalent of Donald Pleasance's character, who is also a little confusingly motivated, because I believe he's supposed to be a spy, but it's also implied that he's sabotaging things because he's claustrophobic and he wants to get out of there or something. Like he wants them to just leave or something like that. But it's Donald Pleasance. I'm not going to question him too much. But here it's just like, I'm basically a good guy. I'm clearly motivated. I want to do this because I want to prove my technology, blah, blah, blah. And he's a bit of a douche. And then he just decides he's going to, try and betray Richter. And it doesn't make any sense. And that also gets brought up in the coverage, as does Yuko's bizarre relationship with him, where we're not entirely sure what brings her over to Richter's side, other than the fact that he made that Frank Capra-esque speech back in the lung. And it's all a little weak. I honestly think it would have worked better if he was, if we saw him kind of, because he is supposed to be cracking a little bit from the hypothermia and the stress of the situation. That is mentioned a couple times. It would be interesting if he was cracking a little bit and in the face of this newly constructed, highly dangerous Mamabot, or just big nanobot, because Mamabot is stupid. If he decides, oh shit, I have to take responsibility for this and destroy it myself, and I know I probably won't make it out alive, that would be a better arc for his character, and it would work better with what we see in the final scene, which we'll get to in a minute. And so as the operation is prepared, the team decide to follow the optic nerve to the eye and escape, and Richter, decides to rely on his instincts to find the way. He went against his instincts, and that screwed up, and so he doesn't want to trust his instincts anymore, and blah, blah, blah. So that's kind of his arc here. And so they make it to the eye, and they're crawling around inside the eye, and this is very cool. It bookends the beginning, and they can actually see the surgeons outside the eye, just magnified. Very cool visual. And so they have to hurry and climb, and Yuko, who is really badly feeling the effects of the hypothermia, she's exhausted, and Tubbs offers to carry her, so he's, getting over his racism, essentially. He's learned his lesson. And I do like Tubbs in this moment. Like, the arc they have for Tubbs is actually really good. I just wish the early lines from him had been a little less cringy and, hammering the nail on the head like they did. But I do like this ending for his character, that he's carrying her out, and it adds a little something to the ending that we'll get to. Because he's the one who dies, as we already know. And so they can't get the lids open, and they almost despair, until Richter gets the idea to exit through the tear duct, and that makes him cry. And then Yo realizes what's happening when he sees the tears and halts the operation, finding the team with a microscope and picking them up with a syringe. The president then shows signs of recovery, and we see a body in the process of being reconstructed, and we see the white of the eye getting reconstructed, and it zooms in on that, and it match cuts to the white of a piece of paper, and it's to have the peace treaty being signed by the president, who honors Richter by giving him the pen as a sign of thanks, and Richter is very obviously overcome by emotion here. That's really good. I really like this ending. We then see the rest of the survivors, and only Tubbs is missing, and, Yuko's actually really sad about it, and the audience is sad too, despite him being a racist piece of shit for a bit of it. And, and it says his storage unit malfunctioned. And then it cuts to Mount Fuji, where Richter and Yuko, who apparently are a couple now because they're acting like one, they climb to the top and they scatter the remains of Underhill, and that's where it ends. And so the way this script is, would they really scatter the remains of Underhill, or would they scatter the remains of Tubbs? Because Tubbs was the one who really seemed to bond with Yuko a little bit more, whereas Underhill just was a douche and then decided, my fucking Constructobot was more important than, the fate of the goddamn world. So yeah, but I mean, it's a nice moment. But you need if we made those changes to Underhill's character and maybe went a little bit deeper into Yuko's character as well, because I mean Richter's a pretty good character. Pooley serves his purpose and is funny, even if the anti-smoking message is very 90s and just how nail on the head it is. And I mean maybe get rid of more of the Navy SEALs because they don't need to be here. And just, I don't know, just do something else with it. Like, you need to fix Underhill and you need to fix Yuko. Those are the big fixes you need to make. Condense down the fucking dialogue. I don't think this is a bad script, but it's very rough. It's very obviously a first draft. And I think, with, a little bit more time, a little bit more revision, this could have, really been really, really good. And I think it's a serviceable remake script as it stands, because it's still recognizably Fantastic Voyage while being different. But I do think it needs a lot of work still. And unfortunately, I think they maybe got a revision in or something like that. No, they didn't actually get a chance to do a revision, because what happened was before the script was even turned in, Emmerich and Devlin, they left Fox to make Godzilla at Sony, and they did it. Apparently they did it because they had like a deal with Fox where they said, we'll let you keep the rights to Fantastic Voyage, but we get to take projects we're working on that are personal project, and we can go, we can take those elsewhere if we want to. The big one was Super Tanker, which I want to say was supposed to be like Die Hard on an oil tanker or something like that, that was something which they were very intent on making for a while, and it never got off the ground from what I understand. And so they left and they went to go make Godzilla, and so Fantastic Four, what the fuck verse? Fantastic Voyage, that kind of, went into hibernation. But Fox, I'm going to try and fill in the gaps here. Fox, they hired a new writer who was Tab Murphy, who actually wrote Super Tanker, and he actually wrote an outline for a sequel to Emmerich's Godzilla, which was not bad from what I remember. And he also wrote Atlantis, the Lost Empire for Disney. And they brought him in to rewrite the thing, and it was a rewrite. It kind of followed the general outline of the Morgan and Wong version. And there it was, apparently the miniaturization process is being experimented on, and you see like an experimental chimpanzee gets fucked up by it. And the president, who is white in that version according to Tales from Developmental, he gets shot by a Taiwanese nationalist in this version, and the bullet hatches out 5 nanobots which start wreaking havoc inside his body. And so a team gets sent in to take out the nanobots, and the Navy SEALs get killed early, and so we're left with Agent Richter, who's still the main character, and the scientists have to deal with it on their own. I would really like to read that version, because that sounds really interesting and like a possibly interesting revision of this version, while making the nanobots maybe a bit more relevant. And it sounds like just having the nanobots be part of the assassination attempt cuts down on the exposition a lot. But yeah, apparently the draft was received, but it was considered too similar to Armageddon, which had just been released. And so it kind of withered on the vine there. And then it got picked up by James Cameron in 1998. And that eventually leads to the next draft, believe it or not. I say that brings us into our next script, but it's a little bit more complicated than that, because like with several other projects like Alita Battle Angel, James Cameron was planning on making it, but settled on producing it because he got so caught up in working on Avatar, and since Avatar, the Avatar sequels, which he's been working on for the last few years, which should be seeing the light of day in another couple of years finally, like over a decade after the first one came out, but whatever, that's a subject for another time. And so development on this went on for quite a while during the 2000s, and there were multiple scripts. There's some writers, I'm not really sure who they were, but the next script that came up, and this is definitely part of the Cameron phase of development because he's still supposedly producing this even now, is the Rick Jaffa and Amanda Silver script, which we're talking about next. It's dated April 28th, 2006. Now, the basic plot of this one is that we're in a much more distant future than what the Morgan and Wong script proposed. Instead of being like 20 years in the future or close to it, in this one, it's in the back half of the 22nd century, and most of the world has been taken over by a few rich in oil and technology countries, and it's become this place called the Alliance, and they're encroaching on everything, and the United States is one of the last nations left that's, independent, and, the last bastion of freedom, as they call it in the script. And the Alliance does this nasty thing to its citizens where it wants to keep track of them at all times, so it plants this implants, I should say, because these are called implants, these tracking devices, which not only tell you where you are, but they keep you within a certain radius, and if you leave that radius, you blow up. Well, the plot to this one revolves around a spy for the US steals a new experimental kind of implant and injects it into herself to smuggle it out so they can learn from it and maybe get an edge in the war. And so they have to go into her bloodstream to take care of the two implants, and there's some things involving her ex, and it's a team of, once again, Navy SEALs and scientists, but it's mainly her ex who is an expert at getting rid of, implants. But because of the nature of this one, they have to go in on the micro scale to do it instead of using, their own drones. And it turns out that they are not actually alone in the bloodstream. There's something waiting for them. But yeah, moving on into the script, Rick Jaffa and Amanda Silver, they're a couple of writers who, they've done a few pretty interesting things. Rise of the Planet of the Apes is really, really good. And they also contributed to Dawn of the Planet of the Apes, which I'm alone in that I think that's my least favorite of that trilogy. I go War, Rise, Dawn, but that's just me. And I don't really know how much they contributed or if they were heavily rewritten by the other writers. I haven't really researched that. But they also wrote the original draft of Jurassic World, which I would love to get my hands on, but probably never will. That actually sounds really, really damn interesting. But, they're very much, the science fiction people. They sing almost entirely by themselves are what made, a new Planet of the Apes series viable, because they looked at their script and went, hey, we could turn this into an Apes movie. And they did, and that's that. But no, getting into the script, we start off with, and probably one of my least favorite tropes whenever it's used outside of Star Wars, and that is an opening text crawl, and it's explaining that we're towards the end of the 22nd century, and they specify that the year is 2185. It talks about, what I described, the world has been subsumed by the Alliance, and they plant these things on its citizens to keep them from stepping out of line, and the United States is the last bastion of freedom, which sounds like something you'd put in a Roland Emmerich movie. Which we'll get back to him when we're done talking about the script, interestingly enough. And so you get all that, and then it all turns into, the text forms a circle, which then match cuts to an extreme close-up of the eye of Megan Colby, who's getting retinal scanned in an Alliance laboratory. So yeah, we did the opening text crawl, although it was thankfully pretty brief. And we're setting up this whole new context, which is interesting because it's entirely different from the setup of Fantastic Voyage of setting it in a recognizable world. Here we're pushing it into the future, I guess, to make the technology more plausible. I guess that's the idea, but it's interesting. I don't know if I like it for a Fantastic Voyage movie, though. I like the idea of it being contemporary. We're just using this highly classified technology, so I like the Morgan and Wong draft better in that respect. But she's, getting her eye scanned in the Alliance laboratory, and we then see a Dr. Stephen Lim who has this, he's in front of this tank of fluid which has a silver orb with like tendrils on it, and he sucks that out. He sucks the fluid out with a hypodermic needle, and they bump into each other in the hallway, accidentally, in air quotes. And so she gets the hypodermic needle, and then she injects it into herself in the bathroom moments later, and then flushes it down the toilet, and it dissolves in the water. So hypodermics are biodegradable in the future. Man, I bet drug addicts would love that. And so after leaving the lab, Megan and Dr. Lim attempt to flee from the Alliance community they live in. And this is apparently in Canada, going by the fact that there's an Alliance flag and a Canadian flag. So sorry, Canada, you got taken over by the collective. And they're warned by a computer voice that detonation is imminent because they're driving in a car. And they kind of delay the detonation by making it look like they're turning around and driving away and then getting out and running back over towards these rocks. And Megan gets picked up by a camouflaged U.S. airborne led by Bruce Parr, who's her commanding officer, and she's a special ops agent, who attaches this silver disc to her neck, which it's basically meant to jam the signal from like the central control area or whatever, so that she doesn't blow up immediately. But, it's too late for Lim, who explodes, leaving only charred clothes behind, because I guess they're going for a PG-13. So that's a pretty cool opening, and the Alliance community is actually shown as being very pretty and well-manicured and idyllic looking, which makes for a contrast with when we see America in the second. And so we then meet Dr. Charles Grant, who is teaching some students how to pilot a microscopic device called a rover, ROV being capitalized, and they never tell you what that stands for, through the bloodstream to disable the Alliance implants, and he explains that you have to cut the correct 3 cables or the patient will blow up and die. And we see that he has experienced just this when he takes off his gloves to reveal his burned hands. We'll get a little bit more backstory on that later. And so he's leaving the University Medical Center, and we see that, the campus is much more run down than the Alliance community. So the Alliance is aesthetically better, and they're probably in better economic shape, but they lack all freedom compared to what America is in this future. But he's leaving, and he gets grabbed by some people and pushed into a van where he runs into Parr. And it's clear that they have some bad history together. There's a lot of mentions of her, so you get an idea that there's some tension between them over a woman, and you can fill in the blanks that's meant to be Megan. But him and Parr don't like each other at all, and they butt heads a lot in the script. And so Grant is flown to Los Alamos, where a secret futuristic lab has been built underneath the ruins of the old research center. I actually really like that image, and it also reminds me of Ang Lee's Hulk, where they go out to the old nuclear testing site, and there's a lab underground that's been built there since then. I mean, that's a pretty interesting idea. Although here, thankfully in this script, there's not like a million different camera angles playing at the same time. It's one of those things that always bugs me about that movie. So he's given the lowdown of what's going on. He's met by a General Norris, who's in charge of the operation, and him and Parr, and Dr. Tardio, who's also in charge. They give him the idea. They tell him what's going on. They say that Megan has smuggled a new type of implant in from the Alliance, which is located in the brain, as opposed to the old type of implant, which is attached to the spine lower down along the torso. And they say it has a microchip in it full of information that could help win the war. And their plan is to pilot a submarine called the Barracuda into her bloodstream and use it to disable both implants from the inside. And although the implant signals have been jammed, they only have 6 hours before Megan is killed by them. So that's this script's version of the ticking clock. In the original, it's that they only have an hour before they go back to normal size. And in the other script, it was, they're suffering from hypothermia. And this is, we can only keep this thing go. We only have so much time to do this because the implants will go boom, which is a pretty decent ticking clock. And so Grant and Parr, while looking at Megan lying unconscious on the operating table, argue about the mission, with Grant thinking that it will be impossible, and, disapproves of Megan's work as a spy. And there's a lot of personal history between the three of them, and Parr is sure that this will convince Grant to go along with the plan because he cares about Megan. That's a problem with this script, is that the pacing is a lot better than the last one, but the characters are a bit better defined. It just takes a little while to understand what's going on between these three people, especially since one of them is on the table. It takes a little bit too long to unfold this, I think. I think that's a problem with it. And so the crew consists of Parr, Grant, Captain McCabe, his second officer, Lieutenant Elliot, Engineer Shelley, Navigator Gideon, Communications Guy Vernon, and some Navy SEALs, Team Leader Julian, Jokey Demolitions Expert Bobby, the younger guy Kevin, and Serious Frankie, these two apparently being in love. Now this is the thing that's bad about the characterization in this script, is that it literally lists all these people out and gives you either their jobs or a couple of personality traits, and that's the only development you get. Now, I do like some of the character stuff between these guys, but it would have been better if that would have been given to you more naturally, instead of the script just going, this is who these people are, this is what they do, this is what they're like, just in the form of a list. I think that's a little clunky in terms of the writing. And they're also Kevin and Frankie, they're each secretly in love with the other, and neither of them knows about it, knows that it's reciprocated, which is just awkward, and we'll get to that later. And they all gather in uniform, including Grant, who shows up late, so it's like he resisted the call, but then he did eventually show up. And he'll be watched over from the outside by Norris and Tardio. The Barracuda gets shrunk down first on the scaling stage, and then the crew is, and they talk about how the process seems like it would be pretty painful, but has no apparent consequences. And basically what happens is there's a big flash of light, and they get reassembled, or they don't really say how it works here, which I would like a little bit more insight into that, but I'll take that over the God knows how many pages of technical exposition from the other script. So yeah, that's another improvement on this version compared to the last version. Also, the pacing is so much better. Like, we get this mission set up really quickly. So the crew boards the ship and prepares for departure to make sure everything is secured and in place. All systems are working, and the 4 torpedoes they're given are safely stowed away, and they say, hey, there's not anything we're going to really need to be shooting at, so we don't need more than 4. And they get sucked up into a syringe held by a mechanical arm, and they're injected into Megan's femoral artery. So we're already doing some things that are different in an intriguing way from the original, in that we're not following the same exact route from the neck to the brain. In fact, the idea that the other implant is much lower down means they have a second goal they have to do, which means it's a more complicated and a different version. So I like that. And from here, Elliot plots out the course through the iliac and sacral arteries to the first implant in the spine. And yeah, they are more specific about which sacral artery it is, but I didn't write all of that down because that got a little tedious for me after a while. And then they bypass the heart through the thoracic region and connect to the vertebral artery, leading them straight to the second implant in the brain, before heading to the extraction point in the jugular vein. So yeah, we got our whole course mapped out for us. Grant gives the crew a warning not to underestimate the body's defenses, saying that, it essentially has evolved to get rid of any foreign objects, and we're a foreign object and technically a threat, so we have to be careful. So that's a nice little speech, I think. And just after this, the artery starts to constrict and increase the pressure to untenable levels, and Grant says, oh, there's scar tissue inside Megan's leg from when she broke it a decade ago. And he says, I looked out the window, I saw it was pushing into the arterial wall, and he says, McCabe, just continue forward, you should be able to squeeze through, and it's a tight fit, but it does manage without any damage. And so Grant, he's in the sick bay, checking through Megan's body scan and medical files, and he pulls up an interview recording of her. And then Bobby walks in to tell him they're approaching the first implant, and he makes some salacious remarks about her, saying, I'd do her. And from Grant's reaction, this is where we figure out that he was, they used to be an item, but she left him, and he says she disappeared on him, and the idea being that she chose her job over him. And on the bridge, McCabe and Julian put together the plan for leaving the sub to deal with the implant, with Grant directing from inside. However, the close proximity of the electrical impulses from the spinal cord have knocked out the electrical systems on the Barracuda, forcing Grant to have to go with the SEAL team, who give him a crash course in SEAL hand signals so he can communicate with them, and that's pretty funny. And Grant, while they're changing into their diving outfits, Grant sees a scar on Julian's chest, which he says was the remains of a primitive implant torn out after he escaped an Alliance prison camp. So yeah, you get a nice bit of backstory for Julian, so these characters aren't entirely interchangeable, but they're still not fantastic. And so Grant and the SEALs, which are Julian, Kevin, and Bobby, and Frankie wanted to go out, but she keeps getting, forced to stay on board. I'm not sure if that's meant to be Julian being sexist or if that's just the way it shakes out. The script's not specific about it. And so they go out, they leave the ship, entering the bloodstream on vehicles called DPVs. And what's interesting here is that the surface, when they open the airlock, the surface tension keeps the blood from flooding in, so it's like a membrane they have to pass through to get out. I thought that was a very interesting idea. I'm not sure if that's scientifically accurate necessarily, but I think it makes for a cool visual, a cool idea. And they swim through a capillary, and they locate the first implant, finding the right cables to cut. And they succeed in taking it offline, but Kevin's blowtorch goes out, and he decides to use his knife, accidentally cutting his suit and arm open in the process. And I'm like, oh god, that was stupid. This reminds me of, if you've ever seen The Edge with Anthony Hopkins and Alec Baldwin, the trailers completely leave out the fact that there's a third person who gets stranded in the Alaskan wilderness with them. It's Harold Perrineau. And get this, they give him a knife, tell him to cut a stick into a spear. They walk like 5 feet away to have a conversation. They hear him scream, come back, and he has somehow managed to slice his leg open really deeply. And it's like, how stupid is this guy he managed to do that? It's almost kind of like this here. But yeah, enough about that. But his blood starts to attract white blood cells, and the way they're described as just emerging from the arterial walls is really, really cool. And they pursue the 4-man team as they try to return to the Barracuda. Kevin hangs back to try and head the cells off, but his blasts just make them split up into more cells, and they converge on him, and they just absorb him and kill him. They destroy him. So Bobby, he emerges from the capillary and successfully boards the Barracuda again, but the DPV with Julian and Grant aboard hits a bump, and Julian goes flying, holding onto the edge of the artery for dear life. And he gets attacked on the arm by a white blood cell, but Grant goes back for him and saves him, getting him aboard safely with only a burned arm. So pretty exciting little sequence there. And Frankie quietly mourns Kevin. Bobby expresses guilt for not checking up on him, and they never really build on that again, unfortunately. And Parr mildly commends Grant for saving Julian, and there's a moment where he's like, I don't mean to pat you on the back here, but you did do a good job. So it's kind of a backhanded compliment, which I thought was kind of fun. And the building respect between those two characters, even if the tension between them isn't as well defined early on as it should be, the building respect, I think, is actually a pretty strong element of their characters. And so, however, their troubles aren't over as Vernon speaks up saying that something has pinged them, meaning that another submarine is in the bloodstream. And they apprise the team on the outside about the situation and watch as whatever it is approaches on the sonar screen. And it turns out to be an Alliance drone called a Moray, which they think may have been attached to the new implant. Elliot suggests that this could have been a setup on Megan's part, much to Grant's chagrin, but they have no time to argue as the attack commences. So yes, we have basically a war going on in the bloodstream, which is a kind of a cool idea, actually. The drone fires a torpedo at the Barracuda, which it dodges, only getting a scrape on the side, but the explosion sets off Megan's vital signs. It shoots another torpedo at them, but they fire back, and the two torpedoes collide, exploding, and it seems to have knocked over the drone, but it rights itself, forcing the Barracuda to flee against Parr's wishes to stay and fight. Grant sees that the artery is flooded with adrenaline, which acts as a constrictor, and proposes a plan to lead the drone into a capillary and trap it. And there's this big suspenseful chase that happens with the Barracuda, it gets out of the capillary maze around the kidney just in time for the drone to get trapped inside, which is very exciting, very well written. And Parr isn't happy, saying that they're just putting off the inevitable, but they continue on their way, heading for the brain. And there's a brief scene on the outside with Tardio confirming that Megan is stable, so we know she's okay. And an odd scene kind of happens on the Barracuda where Julian bumps into Parr and asks him if the drone will find them, to which he says he thinks it will and walks off. That's a weird scene that only serves for foreshadowing. We'll get to what that foreshadows later. Now, like I said, this is a cool idea of a war in the bloodstream, but part of me thinks that maybe the charm of Fantastic Voyage is kind of the man versus nature, while inside a man, it's like a big part of that, but I don't, and kind of putting, a human enemy in there, even if it is a drone and into the science fiction story, it kind of dilutes that charm maybe a little bit. I'm not sure. I haven't really made up my mind on it, if what I'm saying makes any sense. Okay, and so the crew moves on to the arteries near the lungs, where they plan to punch through out of the bloodstream and head for the brain. Bobby and Frankie head out to make the cut with their lasers, and they marvel at the sight of blood oxygenating. And that's one thing I like about this, is that they show you a lot of things in this that would be very visually interesting, like the electricity coming off the spinal cord. That first scene where they enter the bloodstream and look out the window would be very cool. And this scene, there's a good sense of wonder and awe to this script, which I like. And that's when the Barracuda gets pinged again, and the drone shows back up and attacks, firing off 2 torpedoes. One of which Bobby collides his DPV into and destroys before it reaches their sub, and the other glances off the sub, tearing a hole in the lung. And so Grant has to send a message to the outside telling them to intubate Megan, so to get her lung working again, and they manage to make the drone twirl away with their 2 remaining torpedoes, but then they notice that everything is stopped. Grant has them send the message to Tardio to use the defibrillator to restart her heart, despite McCabe's and Elliot's objections that their mission isn't about saving Megan, but retrieving the microchip. And so Parr backs Grant, though, and the defibrillation process goes ahead. The jolts of electricity jar the ship, but succeed in saving Megan's life, and that respect between Grant and Parr seems to increase a bit more. And things start to go wrong again, however, and they get sucked straight into the heart, the immense pressures of its contractions wreaking havoc on the ship, so that's a new difference. Now, we have another unscheduled trip to the heart in this version, but here the heart does not stop. Here, they have to go through it full pressure, and it's incredibly exciting and intense. I think this is a good version of this scene. And they make it through mostly intact with 0 casualties, but the communications have been knocked out, which means they have to navigate without a map. Grant pointing them towards the vertebral artery. And to make things worse, they were pinged again right before they entered the heart, meaning the drone is still on them, and it could have survived, that trip through the heart as well. And then Grant watches more of Megan's interview, where he learns that Megan was told he had died operating on someone with an implant, so that's where he got the burned hands. And so he confronts Parr, hitting him and knocking him down, and he tries to justify it by saying she was an important operative and that the relationship was causing her to lose her edge. And Grant, on the other hand, attributes it to pure jealousy, saying that Parr was always in love with her, but Parr gets him to settle down, saying that while he doesn't like Grant, he trusts him. He reveals that he thinks there's a tracking device on the sub placed by one of the crew members who turned traitor, reasoning it's the only way the drone could keep finding them. Now a couple things here. That is where we finally get, the entire sort of story between these 3. And it's a little I didn't need the love triangle aspect of it, like the idea of him being just a no-nonsense commanding officer who wants her to keep her edge would have been enough. And on top of that, just the whole thing of this being like a love triangle, that she was never in love with him and stuff like that. I'm like, well, you always wanted to be inside her, Parr, and you finally got your wish. But I apologize for that joke. That was terrible. But I had to make it. And this whole idea of the tracking device, what he says is that they searched the submarine up and down before they brought it to the facility, and even after they got it there. So they reasoned that it could only have been brought on board by someone after they had been shrunk down. So that means that's how he knows it has to be somebody on the crew who is the traitor. And they say, well, it can't be McCabe, so if he was the traitor, we would all be dead by now. You know, he's the captain, we would all just be fucked. So they bring him in on the secret, and they say they plan to lure the drone into a trap using the tracking device. And so as the sub approaches Megan's brain and they're only a capillary maze away from the final implant, the drone begins to approach again. And so they plan to send Frankie and Bobby out to sneak up on the drone and attach explosive devices to its hull, but Julian insists on going despite his injury, forcing Frankie to stay inside. They approach the drone on DPVs, and Bobby gets his device attached to it before getting attacked by Julian, revealing him to be the traitor. And yeah, okay, that was something where as soon as they did that weird scene of him and Parr just randomly talking, it's like, okay, I know who this guy, I know it's gonna be him. Like, yeah, the scar on his chest was mentioned earlier, was more subtle foreshadowing than, oh hey, let's have this weird conversation between these two for no reason. And so we get a pretty decent hand-to-hand fight before Julian cuts Bobby's oxygen and like puts him in a big bear hug, basically forcing him to choke to death and pass out. And so Julian attaches his body to one of the DPVs along with one of the explosive devices and pushes him off into the bloodstream, setting off the explosion. He returns to the Barracuda saying that the drone has been destroyed and that Bobby died because he was goofing off too much. Like, they have a special word for it, I forget what it is. But they say, oh, he goofed off again one too many times, I wasn't able to save him. And so the Barracuda, from there, it moves into the choroid aqueduct, which is along the brain, finding the second implant. Julian, Grant, and Frankie head out and begin searching for both the chip and the detonator cables that need cutting. And there are like these tendrils that are jutting out of the implant with sensors on the end designed to set off the explosives if they touch anything. And so while this is going on, Parr and McCabe see the drone approaching again, and Parr realizes that it's following Julian and that the tracker is under his chest scar. So okay, yeah, smart characters figuring shit out. And back at the implant, Grant and Frankie have found the panel with, I wrote microscope here, I meant microchip, under it, and are working on getting to it. Meanwhile, Julian is reaching out for the sensors to end everything when Parr slams into him, telling the other two that Julian is the traitor. And they're fighting, and it's a pretty cool fight, and then Parr just cuts Julian to make him bleed, lashes him to a DPV, and then pilots it towards the drone, and this attracts the white blood cells again, which attack and destroy all of them, so Parr gets a pretty decent heroic sacrifice. Grant and Frankie get to the chip, which is wrapped in 3 of the detonation cables. They cut them, but the implant is still active. So Grant goes, hey, Frankie, take the chip and go. You know, so I'm going to give you the extra 5 minutes we have left because they're getting close to the edge here. Get extra 5 minutes to escape, and he tells her if he's successful, he'll head for the tear duct, but he says, you'll have to make Megan cry, and I've never seen her do that, so here's the message to pass along to make her do that. Say, I'm alive, and that I always found you hard to live with, Megan, but you were easy to love, blah, 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 which is kind of corny, but whatever. And the Barracuda heads for the extraction point while Grant enters the center of the implant to try to disable it. He finds like a hatch which leads inside. And he finds an array of optic cables, too many to pick out, just 3 to cut, and the submarine crew, they're extracted and scaled back, and Frankie's like, I gotta go talk to Megan, because she's gonna be waking up soon. And Grant gets the idea to use one wire and Megan's brain electricity to overload the implant, so he yanks out the wire, sticks it into her brain, and the electrical impulses cause it to burn out. So that saves her. And he makes his way to the eye where he sees it opening. Like in the other draft, he's looking out from the inside and like seeing people, and he sees Frankie walk over and say something, but he can't hear her. But you get the idea that she passes on the message, and so he dives into the draining tear duct and is scooped up and placed on the scaling stage by Tardio. And he's brought back to his normal size and ends with him locking eyes with the now awakened Megan. So yeah, that's the Jaffa and Silver version of this, and I think it's a pretty decent script. Like, I wouldn't call this bad. I have my issues with it as a Fantastic Voyage script. I prefer, a more contemporary edge to Fantastic Voyage. Personally speaking, I think the other draft I like more in spite of it having more problems to it, because I feel like if that had been worked on a lot more and had a lot of the kinks worked out, I think that would have been a really damn good Fantastic Voyage movie, whereas this is a really good science fiction movie with the basic premise of Fantastic Voyage, if that makes any sense. The big problems here are the characterization, because we don't learn enough about Grant's and Megan's relationship to really make it work. like, to really feel anything for it. Like, we don't get enough about it, and most of what we get comes very, very late in the game, so it's too late to really invest the audience. And Parr's whole part in it did not need to be a romantic thing. It could have just been he's her boss and he wants her to keep her edge, like I said. And the Navy SEALs, we could have made more of their characterizations. Like, you could have made more of it. You could have, inserted it a little bit more organically. You could have had, if you're going to set up the love affair between the two of them, just have them be together, and then have Kevin be the one who gets killed specifically by Julian later on, and then so when they're fighting at the end, have her take part in his downfall. That would be a much more dramatically satisfying arc. And the ending is just as it's kind of an abrupt ending no matter what you do, where it's like, because in the original movie, they just get out and they come back to normal size, and we never find out if, the guy survived the operation or not, if they got the information they needed or anything like that. And in this, it's like, okay, Megan is saved, but what about the bigger picture thing of the war? Like, the United States is still outnumbered. Did the information on this microchip really help that much? I have my doubts. I just don't know enough to say one way or another for sure. So it's a little weak in that aspect, and once again, I prefer a more contemporary edge. And apparently, I'm not the only one who feels that way, because Roland Emmerich in 2007, a year after this was written, was asked about Fantastic Voyage again. He said, Cameron came to me and said, hey, I'm only going to be producing this one. Would you like to direct it? What do you think? And he says, he showed him the script. And he didn't say who wrote it, but he said, it was set in the far future, and I didn't like that. And he didn't like the militarized aspects of it, like the increased military presence and being a war in the bloodstream. He didn't like that either. And so he's very clearly talking about this draft. And so he didn't like it. And he was friends with one of the executives at Fox, who said, hey, will you still do this if we allow you to start on a page one rewrite from the beginning and start over? He said, sure. And so they brought in Cormac and Marianne Wibberley to write it. And they're best known for the 2 National Treasure movies. And they've done some other stuff, but those are their 2 big ones. And they're going to go get to work on it. And then the writer's strike happened, delaying progress. And by the time they actually got a draft written, Emmerich was knee deep in working on 2012. So he kind of, parted ways with the project at that point. And it continued on for a while after that. James Cameron was still pushing to produce it, and different writers and directors were attached. Like, I've seen, references to Leda Kalogridis, who worked on Avatar, and Alita Battle Angel, who's one of Cameron's people. They work together a lot. They know each other. And Shane Salerno, who wrote some stuff, like, he was on board to do it at one point. And in terms of directors, they were in talks with Paul Greengrass, but that didn't go anywhere. Sean Levy was attached to write it. To direct it at one point, but he apparently left because he wanted some specific actor and they wouldn't let him cast him or something. It was weird. I forget the details of that. And then later on in 2017 was the next major sort of announcement, because even before that, there was the announcement that David Goyer was going to write it and his new writing partner, Justin Rhodes, they were going to do it together. But then in 2017, it was announced that Guillermo del Toro was supposed to direct a new version of it based on that script. And it seemed like it was going to be a go, but then he was working on Shape of Water, and that came out, and so he had to focus on, the award season stuff with that. And then he decided, I'm going to take a year off from directing, and so that pretty much, killed his involvement with it. And he's still like the guy attached to it, but now he's working on a completely different movie, so who knows if it's ever going to happen now. But yeah, that pretty much takes us up to date. I'd actually like to read that version of it just to see what it's like. But, that takes us up to date. Fantastic Voyage, still an idea that you could make a pretty damn good remake out of. I hope it gets done someday, and I hope it's a really, really good, really well thought out version. Heck, I'd love to see Del Toro do it still. Or even, Roland Emmerich, not so much, because he's kind of gone off the deep end lately with, he's been off the deep end for a while now. But, Independence Day Resurgence probably proved he shouldn't be doing any more big blockbusters. At least not too big, or at least he should have more of a leash on him. But yeah, it's an idea I would love to see get made eventually. So yeah, Fantastic Voyage, 2 interesting, if flawed, scripts, but both very well worth reading, and they were both interesting takes on the subject matter. So yeah, I think that's about it. Hopefully you enjoyed this, and until next time, guys, whatever that episode ends up being, bye.